He walked into a police station and confessed. What he revealed shocked everyone. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at the Westbrook Police Department when a man walked through the front doors, his face pale, his hands trembling. He looked like any other distressed citizen, perhaps ready to report a stolen car or a missing wallet. But the room fell silent when he stepped up to the desk sergeant and uttered 6 chilling words. "I killed someone, years ago." At first, the officers exchanged skeptical glances. Confessions weren't unheard of, but most were ramblings from drifters or those desperate for attention. But something about this man, his hollow eyes, the weight in his voice, made it clear. This wasn't a false confession. This was something else entirely. At Beneath the Surface, we uncover the stories that were meant to stay hidden. Lies, betrayals, corruption, because the truth is never what it seems, until you dare to look beneath the surface. Are you ready to uncover the untold? To see beyond the lies? Then like, comment below, share, and subscribe for more. The town of Westbrook, a quiet suburban enclave, was where serious crime was rare. People left their doors unlocked. The most the police had to deal with were the occasional bar fights or shoplifting incidents. But 20 years ago, a case had gone cold. A case that had haunted a grieving family and a relentless detective ever since. The victim was Hannah Caldwell, a 19-year-old college freshman who vanished without a trace one October evening. She had left her friend's dorm around 9 p.m., but never made it back home. Her disappearance had sent shockwaves through the town, leading to search parties, national headlines, and desperate pleas from her family. But despite months of investigation, no trace of Hannah was ever found. No body, no clues, just silence. Now, 2 decades later, this man claimed to have the answer everyone had been waiting for. Detective Mark Grayson, who had worked the case years ago, was called in immediately. Sitting across from the stranger in the interrogation room, he studied him carefully. The man introduced himself as Daniel Reeves, a name that had never come up in the original investigation. "I took her," Daniel began, his voice shaking. "I killed Hannah Caldwell." Detective Grayson leaned in. "Tell me everything." What unfolded next was a story no one could have predicted. Daniel described how, on that October night, he had seen Hannah walking alone. He was 23 at the time, battling his demons, substance abuse, rage issues, and a darkness he barely understood himself. He claimed he had no intention of killing her, only to scare her. But something inside him snapped. He took her, and what happened next was a blur of violence and regret. He hesitated before continuing, his fingers clenching into tight fists. She fought back. She screamed, and I panicked. I grabbed her by the throat, and then she was gone. His voice cracked, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "I didn't mean to. I swear to God, I didn't mean to." Grayson studied him, his pulse steady despite the storm of emotions in the room. What happened next? Daniel exhaled sharply, looking at his hands as if they still carried the weight of what he had done. "I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I called Kyle." "Kyle Mercer," Grayson pressed, watching for any sign of hesitation. Daniel nodded. "He told me to meet him at the quarry. He said we'd make it go away." The detective leaned forward. "And did he?" Daniel's gaze darkened. "We buried her together, but Kyle, he didn't just want to hide what happened. He wanted to make sure no one would ever find her." He clenched his jaw, his voice growing unsteady. "He broke her bones. He made her fit into a space so small no one would think to search it. He laughed while he did it. And I let him." The room was silent as he detailed where they had buried her body, a location that had never been searched before. Detectives were skeptical but had no choice but to follow up. The location Daniel provided was an overgrown section of Millstone Park, a place that had been overlooked during the initial searches. When officers arrived at the site with cadaver dogs, they weren't expecting much, until they found a fragment of bone. DNA analysis confirmed the unthinkable. Hannah Caldwell had been found. The town reeled as the news broke. Her parents, now in their late 60s, collapsed in grief. They had spent 20 years waiting for answers, and now they had them. But one question remained. Why now? Why confess after all these years? As investigators dug deeper into Daniel's life, they uncovered a chilling past. He had been in and out of rehab, living on the fringes of society. But what pushed him to finally confess? A terminal illness. Daniel had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He had mere months to live. With death looming, he couldn't carry the burden any longer. But was that the whole story? Detective Grayson wasn't convinced. He pushed further, questioning Daniel relentlessly. And then, a bombshell. Daniel hadn't acted alone. He had an accomplice, someone still out there, free. As the investigation unraveled, shocking new details emerged. A second suspect. Daniel revealed that his friend, Kyle Mercer, had been with him that night. Kyle's alibi was fake. Investigators discovered inconsistencies in Kyle's whereabouts on the night of Hannah's disappearance. A betrayal. Daniel confessed because Kyle had threatened to silence him forever. With death approaching, Daniel decided to strike first. The police moved quickly. Within days, Kyle was arrested at his home, his expression unreadable as he was led away in cuffs. But the biggest twist was yet to come. With new forensic technology available, detectives conducted a full excavation of the burial site, uncovering more remains. The position of the bones corroborated Daniel's claim that Kyle had taken extra steps to conceal the body. But something didn't add up. The estimated time of death did not match the timeline Daniel had given. Evidence of post-mortem injury suggested that someone had moved or tampered with the remains years after the murder. A piece of clothing buried deeper than the body contained DNA that didn't match Daniel or Kyle. The case was no longer just about a confession. It was unraveling something much larger. Detectives reopened Hannah's case files, retracing every step. They revisited old witnesses and former suspects. A former security guard, now in a nursing home, revealed that on the night Hannah disappeared, he saw two figures forcing a woman into a car, but he was too afraid to report it back then. A bartender came forward with a new claim. Kyle and Daniel had been arguing heatedly that night at a local bar. The subject? A secret Kyle had been keeping. As detectives dug deeper into Kyle's past, they found sealed juvenile records detailing a history of violence. But the most damning discovery came from an unexpected source, a forgotten storage locker belonging to Kyle. Inside, they found an old leather jacket with traces of Hannah's DNA, a diary belonging to Kyle's ex-girlfriend, detailing disturbing accounts of his obsession with Hannah, a hunting knife tested positive for blood remnants. Confronted with the evidence, Kyle's story fell apart. He tried to claim Daniel was the real mastermind, but his alibi shattered. Witnesses placed him at a gas station near Millstone Park just hours after Hannah's disappearance. A shocking realization emerged. Daniel may not have been the only one involved in Hannah's death. Was there a third person? With pressure mounting, detectives pushed Daniel for more. He hesitated before finally whispering, "There's something I never told you. Kyle wasn't alone that night." This revelation changed everything. A third accomplice was out there, still free. The case was far from over. With new suspects, forensic breakthroughs, and an unraveling web of deception, detectives had to move fast before the real killer disappeared forever. The truth was no longer what it seemed, and this case was about to take its darkest turn yet. The news of Hannah Caldwell's discovery spread through Westbrook like wildfire. The once quiet town was now a storm of emotions: grief, anger, and shock. Candlelight vigils were held in her memory. the townspeople gathering at the church steps to mourn the young woman they had lost 2 decades earlier. Old rumors resurfaced, whispers about Hannah's last days, the strange behaviors of Kyle Mercer, and theories that had circulated for years. Social media exploded with discussions. Former classmates of Hannah shared old photos and stories, some expressing guilt that they had forgotten about her case over the years. Others posted messages of outrage, demanding justice for what had been done to her. The Caldwell family, already devastated, found themselves at the center of the media storm, struggling to process the reopening of their deepest wound. Local news stations covered the story relentlessly, and soon, national media outlets descended upon Westbrook. Crime journalists interviewed former investigators, neighbors, and even retired teachers who had known Hannah. Some residents welcomed the renewed attention, believing it would finally bring closure. Others resented the media frenzy, feeling their town was being exploited for entertainment. Meanwhile, debates raged about Daniel Reeves' confession. Some argued that he had done the right thing by coming forward, and that he was finally seeking redemption. Others were unforgiving, seeing him as a coward who had only spoken up to ease his conscience. And then some remained unconvinced, whispering about a third person involved, someone who had yet to be named. As the investigation continued, the town held its breath, waiting for justice. But in Westbrook, where secrets had festered for years, people were beginning to wonder how much of the truth had come to light. Kyle Mercer had always been a shadow lurking behind Westbrook's most unsettling stories. Long before Hannah Caldwell, there were rumors. Growing up, he was known for his cruelty. His childhood had been marked by unsettling behaviors, torturing animals, bullying weaker kids, and manipulating his way out of trouble. Even as a teenager, he had a sinister reputation. Several girls had accused him of harassment, but nothing ever stuck. His father was wealthy, connected, and ensured that any allegations against his son quietly disappeared. By the time Hannah went missing, Kyle had already been whispered about in connection to other cases, disappearances from nearby towns that bore eerie similarities to Hannah's. Young women vanishing without a trace, cases that were quickly dismissed as runaways. But now, with Daniel's confession, investigators were forced to re-examine those cases through a new lens. As detectives combed through old records, a pattern emerged. Several missing women, dating back over a decade, had last been seen in or near Westbrook. Each case had been closed due to lack of evidence, but with Daniel's testimony implicating Kyle as more than just an accomplice, a chilling possibility took shape. Had Kyle Mercer been a serial predator all along? A deeper forensic search was launched at Kyle's former properties. What they found was horrifying. In a secluded section of the Mercer family estate, cadaver dogs signaled near an abandoned well. Investigators uncovered fragments of clothing, bone fragments, and personal items that belonged to missing women. DNA testing would later confirm that at least 3 of the remains belonged to women who had disappeared between 1998 and 2005. The community of Westbrook was shaken. Hannah Caldwell was not Kyle Mercer's first victim, and she might not have been his last. As investigators pored over cold cases and missing person reports, the horrifying extent of Kyle Mercer's crimes began to unravel. What had initially seemed like a single, isolated murder now pointed to a pattern of sadistic violence stretching back nearly 2 decades. The first known victim, Emily Carter, 2005. Emily Carter was just 19 years old when she vanished from her college campus in Westbrook. She had been seen leaving a coffee shop late at night, her books clutched against her chest, her phone battery nearly dead. Witnesses later recalled seeing a man matching Kyle's description offering her a ride. Her disappearance had baffled authorities. Nobody, no suspects, just a girl who seemingly evaporated into thin air. With Daniel's confession, investigators now had a lead that placed Kyle in the area at the time. The case was reopened and forensic teams scoured areas Kyle was known to frequent. The double disappearance Lisa Caldwell and Maria Jensen, 2011. Lisa and Maria, best friends since childhood, had gone out for a celebratory drink after Maria landed a new job. They were last seen at a dimly lit dive bar on the outskirts of town, the same bar where Kyle had worked as a bartender for several years. CCTV footage from that night was long lost, but one grainy still image showed a figure resembling Kyle standing near the women's booth. Their car was found days later, abandoned near a riverbank, doors locked, keys missing. Their families had spent years searching for answers, their cases fading into the abyss of cold files. But now, investigators were beginning to believe Kyle had lured them out, offering them a ride or promising them another round of drinks. Rebecca Vaughn, 2015. Rebecca was a 32-year-old single mother who had been navigating the modern dating world. She had matched with a man online. His profile used a different name, but the face was unmistakable. It was Kyle. The two had exchanged messages for weeks before finally arranging a date. Rebecca had told her sister she was meeting someone charming but mysterious. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her phone last pinged near a wooded area Kyle often visited. Though no body was ever recovered, her case was now being re-examined with new urgency. Jessica Holloway, 2018. Jessica was a known risk-taker, a traveler who had a habit of picking up odd jobs and moving frequently. When she disappeared, many assumed she had simply moved on again. But her credit cards were never used, and her belongings were left untouched in her apartment. A former co-worker later came forward, remembering that Jessica had been dating a man named Kyle, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. But now it was a crucial lead. Police traced Jessica's last known movements and found traffic camera footage showing her car being driven by a man who looked eerily like Kyle Mercer. With each new revelation, the horror of Kyle's past deepened. The town of Westbrook was shaken to its core. Families who had spent years begging for answers were now confronted with an unbearable truth. The man they had seen at the grocery store, at the local gas station, had been a predator lurking among them all along. And the worst question of all remained: how many more victims were out there, waiting to be found? The trial of Kyle Mercer became the most sensational case Westbrook had ever seen. Media trucks lined the courthouse steps, true crime bloggers dissected every detail, and social media erupted with theories and debates. Was Kyle truly the mastermind? Or had Daniel played a larger role than he admitted? Was justice even possible after so many years of silence? The prosecution painted Kyle as a calculated predator who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. They laid out his pattern of grooming, isolating, and ultimately murdering young women. With Daniel as their star witness, the case seemed airtight, but the defense was relentless. Kyle's lawyer, a high-profile defense attorney hired by his wealthy family, attacked Daniel's credibility. This man sat on his guilt for 20 years, he argued. He's only confessing now to save himself. He introduced inconsistencies in Daniel's statements, pointing out details that had shifted between his initial confession and his deposition. Then came the biggest twist of the trial. Kyle's team introduced evidence suggesting Daniel had been more than just an accomplice. A recovered letter, allegedly written by Kyle to an unknown associate, hinted that Daniel had played a more active role in at least one of the murders. The prosecution fought back, arguing the letter could have been a manipulation tactic by Kyle. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The testimony of the victims' families brought the courtroom to a hush. Lisa Caldwell's mother took the stand, clutching a faded photograph of her daughter. "For years, I prayed for answers," she said, her voice shaking. "I never imagined the man who did it was walking free all this time." The forensic evidence was damning. Traces of DNA linked Kyle to multiple crime scenes, including a hair strand found inside Rebecca Vaughn's abandoned car. A forensic pathologist detailed how the victims' causes of death bore striking similarities, suggesting a methodical approach to murder. Kyle sat emotionless through it all, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the jury. The defense launched a last-ditch effort, arguing that Kyle had been framed. They attempted to introduce an alternate suspect, a local drifter with a history of violence, but the judge dismissed the theory as speculative. Still, the defense's tactics left the jury visibly shaken. As the closing arguments wrapped up, the weight of the case bore down on the courtroom. The prosecution urged the jury to remember the victims, the overwhelming evidence, and Kyle's predatory nature. The defense reminded them of the burden of proof and the possibility that Daniel was twisting the truth to protect himself. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Kyle Mercer, guilty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Kyle remained motionless, his face unreadable while his mother let out a wail from the gallery. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the trial wasn't the end of the story. In the aftermath, authorities reopened multiple cold cases, linking Kyle to even more disappearances. More families came forward, recognizing his face from old memories. Some questions remained unanswered. Were there other accomplices? Could Daniel have done more to stop him sooner? But one truth was undeniable. A predator had finally been caged. Daniel, though spared prison time in exchange for his testimony, would never be free of his past. He disappeared from public view, choosing to live in self-imposed exile. Some believed he moved out of the country. Others whispered that guilt had driven him to an even darker fate. Westbrook would never be the same. The town that had once ignored the signs now bore the scars of its failure. A memorial was erected for the victims, their names etched in stone as a permanent reminder that justice, though delayed, had not been denied. Daniel Reeves had spent years running from the truth, but the truth never ran from him. It clawed at his mind in the silent hours of the night, in the reflection of his own haunted gaze. No amount of alcohol, drugs, or distractions could bury the memories of what he had done, or worse, what he had allowed to happen. For 2 decades he had lived under the weight of a secret so vile it made his own skin crawl. Some nights he convinced himself that he was just an accessory, that it had been Kyle who had taken things too far. But deep down, he knew better. He had been there. He had watched. He had helped. And that made him just as guilty. His confession wasn't an act of bravery. It was desperation. The nightmares had intensified. Hannah's face, her pleading eyes, the sheer terror in her voice before it had gone silent forever. He could still feel the earth under his fingernails from that night, the dampness of the soil as he helped Kyle conceal her remains. As the years passed, the weight of his crime poisoned every part of his existence. Relationships crumbled and friendships eroded. He could never stay in one place for too long, never feel truly at peace. Every woman he loved eventually left, sensing the darkness in him that he tried so hard to hide. Jobs came and went. He could never hold on to stability, because stability meant facing himself, and facing himself was the one thing he couldn't do. But what truly broke him, what finally sent him walking through the doors of the Westbrook Police Department, was the realization that Kyle had never stopped. For years, Daniel had told himself that Hannah was a tragic, isolated mistake. But when whispers of other missing women began to surface, cases that bore chilling similarities to what happened that night, he could no longer lie to himself. He had helped bury a monster, but the monster had kept hunting. And because Daniel had stayed silent, others had suffered. Others had died. As he sat in the interrogation room, hands shaking, staring at the detective across from him, he didn't feel relief. Confessing hadn't lifted the weight from his soul. If anything, it had made it heavier. Because now the world knew what he was. He wasn't just a man haunted by a past mistake. He was a murderer, a coward, a man who had let evil flourish because he was too afraid to stop it. and for that there would never be enough penance. In the aftermath, authorities reopened multiple cold cases linking Kyle to even more disappearances. More families came forward, recognizing his face from old memories. Some questions remained unanswered. Were there other accomplices? Could Daniel have done more to stop him sooner? But one truth was undeniable. A predator had finally been caged. Kyle was transferred to a maximum security prison where he quickly became an infamous figure among inmates. Reports of his cold, unrepentant demeanor spread. Some inmates claimed he boasted about his crimes. Others said he spent most of his time in silence, sketching disturbing images in his cell. Attempts to extract further confessions from him were fruitless. Kyle refused to admit to anything beyond what had already been proven in court. Daniel, though spared prison time in exchange for his testimony, would never be free of his past. He disappeared from public view, choosing to live in self-imposed exile. Some believed he moved out of the country. Others whispered that guilt had driven him to an even darker fate. Journalists tried to track him down for interviews, but he remained elusive, a ghost of his former self. Westbrook would never be the same. The town that had once ignored the signs now bore the scars of its failure. A memorial was erected for the victims, their names etched in stone as a permanent reminder that justice, though delayed, had not been denied. For the families of the victims, closure was bittersweet. Some found solace in the conviction, while others struggled with the reality that Kyle had taken so much from them that could never be restored. Lisa, Caldwell's mother, founded an organization to support families of missing persons, dedicating her life to ensuring no one else had to endure what she had. As the years passed, the legend of Kyle Mercer's crimes lived on in documentaries, books, and crime podcasts. But for the people of Westbrook, it was more than just a story. It was a painful reminder of the darkness that had once lurked among them, hidden in plain sight. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to leave a comment and hit that subscribe button for more gripping true crime stories, because the most shocking truths are always hidden beneath the surface. A man walks into a police station and confesses to a crime that had haunted a town for decades. What he reveals is more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Twisted secrets, a chilling investigation, and a courtroom battle that leaves everyone speechless. Watch as we uncover the dark truth beneath the surface. Like, share, comment, and subscribe for more gripping, true crime stories.